If there was a spring in the area, it might supply the water he needed. Where there was no spring, it would be necessary to dig a well. During the day, the shepherd led his flocks of sheep and goats to an area where they could feed. Sheep tend to follow the shepherd, while goats are more independent and will often run ahead of the shepherd.
At the end of the day, the shepherd brought his flock back to his camp. In order to keep the animals from wandering off, they were placed in an enclosed area. This could be made of piled-up stones, but it was often easier to gather branches from thorn bushes and make a temporary pen for the flock. This enclosure also gave limited protection from predatory animals such as wolves and lions.
Sheep and goats often walk in single file, one after the other. In areas where flocks are pastured periodically, over a period of years, the animals will form small trails which are distinctive to these areas and are not found in areas where the main human activity is settled agriculture.
The winters in the land of Israel can be relatively cold, especially in the hilly regions where sheep and goats are often raised. The animals grow an extra layer of wool or hair to keep them warm in the winter. In the springtime, the shepherds cut or sheared this extra wool and hair. The time of shearing the sheep was an important one for the shepherd. The wool of the sheep and the hair of the goats were often used to make clothing, tents, floor coverings, bags, and many other useful objects. It could also be traded for grain and objects that were needed for daily living.
Jacob and his family went to Egypt as shepherds. There they seem to have maintained this way of life to some extent, and we find Moses asking Pharaoh for permission to go out into the wilderness together with their flocks and herds. However, the Hebrews were more or less settled in one area of Egypt, and they seem to have adopted also certain practices of agriculture.
When the tribes of Israel came into Canaan, they began to build houses and to prepare fields and terraces for fixed agriculture. This was especially true in the north and west of the country, where there is enough rainfall for the growing of crops. Here the landscape is often characterized by terraces. These were constructed by people to catch the rainfall before it could run off from the hillsides.
Wheat and barley production became economically very important in the ancient Near East. In the land of Israel, the Levant, Syria and North Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, the harvest depended on rain. In those areas, the worship of the rain and storm god Baal, or Hadad, became very important. Also among the ancient Israelites, there was always a temptation to worship Baal. In Egypt and in southern Mesopotamia, the harvest depended on rivers overflowing their banks and on irrigation. In those regions, the river gods were worshipped. In addition to the growing of grains such as wheat and barley, several other crops were central to the Israelite economy. Two crops, grapes and olives, were of special importance.
Many parts of the country are ideally suited to the growing of grapes. Grapevines are reused year after year. Preparation for the coming season consists primarily of cutting back the growth from the previous year. This cutting, called pruning, is very radical. A grapevine can grow many meters in one season. At the end of the season, it is cut back to little more than a stump in the ground. This drastic pruning ensures that in the next season, the fruit will be sweet and juicy.
The first ripe grapes appear in the month of June. The harvesting begins in earnest in July and goes on throughout the summer. Towards the end of the summer, in late September or early October, it is the custom to make the first wine, the so-called new wine. Harvesting of grapes consisted of cutting down the bunches of grapes one bunch at a time. After grapes had been dried in the sun, forming raisins, the raisins also, like figs, were gathered into blocks pressed together so that they could be stored over long periods of time. These blocks could be carried on trips and provided a good source of energy on the way.
Most of the grapes, however, were used to make wine, which was the staple drink in the home. The bunches were carried to the wine press, which was often cut out of the bare rock not far from the vineyard. Sometimes a wine press was very small, used by one family for squeezing the juice from a small amount of grapes. Often, there was a kind of community wine press, a place where the whole community could bring its grapes to be pressed, each family in its turn.
As the workers stepped on the grapes, the skins were broken, the juice was released, and the floor of the wine press could become very slippery. Normally, a wooden structure was constructed over the press with ropes hanging down from it. The worker could hold on to the rope, and then if he slipped, he wouldn't fall into the grape juice that he was pressing out. Also released when the grapes were tread out were the seeds from the grapes. If the seeds were broken, then the wine would become bitter. For this reason, the treading of the grapes was normally done with bare feet, so that the seeds would not be broken. Juice from the squashed grapes flowed from the floor into a hole or vat. From there, it was dipped out into earthenware containers or wineskins made from animal skins. Within a few days, the natural sugar in the juice began to ferment. In the early stages of fermentation, while the alcohol content is still relatively low, it is called new wine. New wine was only to be found in the early fall in September. After another period of 2 or 3 weeks, the fermentation resulted in wine.
If the fermentation process was allowed to continue, the end result was sour wine or vinegar. Since the ancient world had no means of refrigeration, other methods were used to slow down the fermentation process. This was done primarily by adding a sweetening agent, such as honey, to the wine. This was referred to as sweetened wine, as in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. Sweetened wine could be kept for many months.
In the ancient world, wine was also concentrated to help preserve it, and wine was normally diluted with water before it was drunk. First of all, the concentrated wine was poured into a vessel, and then afterwards water, with a ratio of 3 or even 4 parts water to each part of wine. Only afterwards was the wine drunk. As with other harvests, the time of the grape harvest and the accompanying production of new wine was a time of great celebration.
Olive trees grow throughout the Mediterranean region, and the production of olive oil has been an important aspect of human culture in the region for almost as long as we have recorded history.
The olive is the small berry of the olive tree. When it ripens in October, it yields oil. The olives are harvested by shaking the tree or beating its branches with a long stick. This causes the olives to fall to the ground where they are collected. Oil is extracted from the olives by pressing. Unlike the extraction of juice from grapes by simply treading on them, olives had to be crushed under considerable weight to extract the oil from them. There were different kinds of olive press, depending on the amount of olives to be pressed. The basic idea was to roll a heavy stone over the olives.
The product that resulted from rolling a stone over the olives was a mud-like paste, containing the pulp and seeds of the olives in addition to the oil. This paste was put in special baskets. These were placed under a log anchored in a wall.
The first oil that came out was of the highest quality. It was the clearest and the tastiest. This first oil was the oil used in the temple service, both for burning in the menorah, the 7-branched lampstand, and also in grain offerings that were mixed with oil. The long pole acted as a kind of fulcrum on the bags with the olive pulp. The fulcrum produced weight on the bags, squeezing the oil out. As more weight was added, more oil could be squeezed out. The closer the weight was to the bags, of course, the less oil would be squeezed out. More weights were added farther away, adding more pressure. Of course, the more weight there was on the bags, the lower was the quality of the oil, because the oil that came out by itself without weight was of higher quality. Olive oil was also a healthy component of the diet. It was used in cooking and for dipping bread and in many other ways. The pulp that was left over after the last pressing could also be used to feed animals or even burned for heat in the home.
The olive tree is extremely hardy and continues to regenerate itself even when it is cut down. For this reason, the new shoot springing out of the dead stump was sometimes used as a symbol for new life. Another tree that supplied edible fruit was the fig tree. It grows in almost all parts of the land. While it does not provide more usable products other than its fruit, it does develop full, broad leaves that make it a good shade tree in the hot months. Nathanael was sitting under a fig tree when Jesus saw him. The fig tree begins to put out leaves in the early spring, in April. About a month later, there appear small green growths on the branches. These are not normally eaten, but they give some indication as to whether the tree will later bear edible fruit.
The ripe fruit of the tree is sweet and can be eaten fresh. The fruit can also be dried in the sun. This concentrates the natural sugar and makes it even sweeter. After the figs have dried in the sun, they're gathered together and pressed into blocks. The purpose of this operation was to keep them from drying out too much. If they were left individual, they would become hard, and also to reduce the operation of the insects which would get into the figs over a period of time. When Abigail came to beg David's mercy for her husband, she brought gifts including 200 blocks of dried figs. Later on, David's men gave a piece of a dried fig block to an Egyptian who had almost died of hunger.
Even though enough rain falls in most places to permit the growing of crops, the soil is still very rocky. This makes it difficult to work the land. The planting of the grain took place in the weeks just before the coming of the first rains in October.
The first step often had to be clearing away larger rocks from the plot of land. The rocks were moved to the edges of the field, where they formed a kind of fence marking off the field. For the most part, this stone fence was not high enough actually to keep out either human or most animal intruders. It was simply a convenient way of removing the stones from the upper level of soil.
The next step was to sow the seed. The seed was carried in a bag or in a fold of the outer garment. The seed was sowed with a casting motion to try to spread it out evenly over the surface. Even though the seed was a precious commodity, sowing was not a precise operation. In the parable of the sower, Jesus said that the seed could fall in other places where it would not be covered by the soil in plowing. Some could fall among the thorns that grew at the edge of the field. Some might fall on the bare rock, which could not be plowed, and others might fall on the hardened pathways that ran next to the field.
Next, the farmer plowed the soil so that it would cover the seed. Seed that remained on the surface was likely to be eaten by birds or ants, and even seed that was not eaten would have difficulty taking root. The plow was made of wood, and only the point of the plow was made of iron, which was strong enough to push through the rocky soil. The plow was attached to an animal, usually a donkey or an ox. The animal wore a yoke around its neck, and the plow was attached to the yoke. Sometimes more than one animal was used, when the soil was particularly difficult to plow through. The yoke could be made of wood or of rope. The farmer carried a pointed stick with him, the goad. With this goad, he could keep the animal in the right direction, or make it move if it became stubborn.
Harvest time came in the spring or in early summer. Barley ripened earlier than wheat and was ready for harvest from late April. Wheat ripened only several weeks later and was ready for harvest at the beginning of summer in June. Wheat and barley, the two main staple crops in Bible times, grow as many individual grains in a head at the top of a stalk of grain. The goal of the whole harvesting process is to get the grain into a condition where it can be used for food. The individual grains are useful as food for people, primarily after they are ground down to flour. This means removing the grain from the field, separating the individual grains from the head, removing the outer covering of the individual grain, and finally grinding the grain into flour.
The first stage in this process was to cut the standing grain. This was done with a kind of curved knife called a sickle. The harvester took a handful of stalks and used the sickle in the other hand to cut the stalks. The actual operation was often closer to tearing the stalks rather than clean cutting. From this bundle of stalks, the worker made a sheaf. The sheaves were easier to handle than piles of loose stalks. It was also possible to stand a sheaf on its end so that the heads of grain were kept off the moist ground until the harvesting was completed. The sheaves were then carried to the threshing floor, which was located not far from the field where the grain was grown. According to Israelite law, any stalks which fell loose were to be left in the field. They could be gathered by poor people, such as widows. This was called gleaning. The widow Ruth was gleaning in the fields of Boaz near Bethlehem.
Threshing is the process by which the grains are separated from the stalk and the head. This operation was carried out on a flat surface. The sheaves of grain were piled in the center of the threshing floor. The grain was taken from the pile and a layer placed on the floor around the pile. Here a special board, called the threshing board or threshing sledge, was drawn over the grain. The bottom of the board was studded with small stones stuck in holes in the board. The board was pulled by an animal, while the worker normally stood or sat on the board, adding to its weight. As the stones passed over the grain, they cut the stalks and knocked the individual grains loose from the head. The outside cover or husk that covered the grain was also broken loose from the grain. It was sometimes the custom to insert metal teeth in the board instead of stones. This was a more expensive and more efficient kind of threshing sledge. This kind of sledge is what is intended by the phrase, iron threshing sledges, found in some of the prophetic books.
For small amounts of grain, it was normal to use a special kind of paddle or a stick to knock the grains loose from the stalk. Even though the proper place for threshing wheat was out in the open, where the wind could blow and the chaff would be blown away, the book of Judges tells us about Gideon threshing his wheat down inside a wine press. I'm standing now in the collecting vat of a wine press, and we can see that it is actually a hole in the ground. Gideon was standing down where he could hide from the Midianites. The action of threshing involved, for small amounts of grain, involved holding a stick and beating the heads of the grain to knock the heads off of the stalks of grain.
Israelite law said that the animal doing the work of pulling the threshing board should not wear a muzzle, so that it would be able to eat grain and straw from the threshing floor. Threshing produced a finely cut mixture of grains, husks, and cut straw.
The next step was to separate the heads of grain from the loose cut material called the chaff. This step is called winnowing. It was done in 2 stages. The first stage took advantage of the significant difference in weight between the heavier grain and the lighter chaff. The worker used a wooden fork to throw the threshing floor mixture into the wind. The lighter chaff would be blown away, while the heavier grains fell to the ground in front of the worker.
Since all of the operation was taking place outside on the ground, it was unavoidable that small stones would also get mixed in with the grain. For this reason, the next stage of winnowing was the separating of the stones from the grains. For this, the worker used a shallow, round basket. The bottom of the basket was made of a mesh, loose enough to allow the grain to fall through, but tight enough to catch stones. Sometimes this operation was repeated with a basket with an even finer mesh.
It would have been possible to prepare flour from all of the grain as soon as it was harvested. However, the whole grain could be stored longer, with less spoiling than could flour.
The grain was stored in a special structure called a silo or a granary. In some translations, this structure is called a barn. It must be kept in mind in translation that the sole purpose of this small structure was to store grain. It was not a building into which people entered.
As flour was needed for food preparation, some of the whole grain was ground between stones. Normally, people ground only as much grain as they needed for that day. Leftover flour could quickly become infested with insects. There are several different types of grinding stone or millstone mentioned in Scripture. In the Old Testament, a hand mill consisted of a larger rectangular bottom stone and a smaller upper stone. The grain was placed on the lower stone, and the smaller upper stone was scraped over the grain, grinding it to flour. This work was normally done by women in the early hours of the morning, before sunrise. It was hard work and took a lot of time. It is estimated that to produce enough flour to make bread for a family of 5, a woman would have needed to grind for over 3 hours each day.
The sound of grinding in the early hours by the light of an oil lamp symbolized stability and security. The prophet Jeremiah describes the tragedy that is to come upon the people when he quotes God as saying, "I will remove from them the sound of the millstone and the light of the lamp."
In New Testament times, there was also another type of mill. This consisted of 2 round, flat stones, one sitting on top of the other. Grain was placed between them, and the upper stone was turned in a circular motion on the lower stone. The normal home millstone was small enough to be turned by hand. There was also a larger, heavier version constructed on the same principle. It was turned by animals or by slaves.
Millstones worked best if they were made of hard, rough stone. One type of stone often used was the black volcanic basalt rock, which came from the Galilean Golan region in the north of the country. We can see from this example of a basalt millstone that the grain was put into a kind of funnel at the top of the stone, where it went down between the stones, was ground with a circular motion of the top stone on the bottom stone, and came out the side where it was collected as flour.
The ground flour was mixed with water and worked together by hand until the dough had a uniform consistency. The dough was baked on heated stones or on an earthenware or metal surface. The bread was flat and round and thin. It was not cut, but rather torn or broken to be eaten.